Sentry mode activated. Target acquired.
Hey there, hunters. I'm back talking about more bow builds here in Elden Ring. This time I'm pretty much at the end game. I only got a couple more bosses left to do, and while I showed this boss fight for Malenia using bow only, I do want to discuss how I feel about them in Elden Ring at this point. Again, if you don't want to hear my rants, please just mute the video and enjoy the fight. Otherwise, here we go. So my enthusiasm for bow builds started out pretty high in Elden Ring. Before the game even came out, I decided I was going to play bow as my main weapon, mostly after seeing that Bandit starts with a short bow and you can craft arrows. I figured, what could go wrong? It should be easy, right? But as I had played more and more and found out, what bows had to offer, I've now entered a state where I just don't like bows at all, and they feel really bad. So I want to talk about all that specifically. So, before I get into it, of course, people are going to say, oh, bow isn't meant to be a main weapon, of course it's bad. But why? Says who? Every other weapon can be a main weapon, why not bows? It's not like bows are always terrible in FromSoft games. Bows in Dark Souls 2 were monsters, and gun build in Bloodborne was amazing, and the bow blade was OP. They can be good, and they certainly have been good in the past, but here in Elden Ring, they're bad, and I just don't really see a redeeming quality to them at all. So the main issue with bows is their scaling. Every single bow caps out at D tier scaling for whatever it scales with, outside of specifically the Golem Great Bow, which gets a C in strength. And because of that, it's pretty much the best bow. Even Radahn's bow at plus 10 is D in strength and dex. The Black Bow, which is usually S tier dex, is still D in strength and dex, even at plus 10. And all the short bows are E in strength, D in dex. Serpent and Erdtree get a D scaling in Faith and Arcane, and that's it. They're all terrible. They all cap out at very terrible scalings. So bows just don't get much damage, and they fall off super hard in the late game. With 60 strength and dex, the Black Bow gets plus 100 damage. Basically every point in one stat is 1 damage, which is nothing when you see most other weapons have plus 200 or plus 300 damage from scaling. So at late game, I can swing normally for a curved sword for 600 damage, or I could jump attack for 2000. But a great bow, which takes 5 seconds to draw and fire, hits for 900, and a longbow hits for 300, headshots excluded. It just doesn't feel good when enemies have 3,000 to 8,000 life, and they do, and it takes you 15 arrows to kill one enemy, whereas you can run in with the power stance weapons and just jump, attack, delete everything in one hit. Now again, people will say bows are for pulling, and yeah, okay, but you can also pull with throwing daggers, and they're just as easily. It doesn't require equipment or weight or anything like that, so why use a bow? And I'll get the throwings at the end. So most weapons have similar scalings to bow, they start out really bad, or they cap out at C tier in their respective scalings, but then you can give them extra scaling with Ashes of War and affinities from the whetstones, so you can add B scaling in intelligence or arcane, or turn a C into dex to an A in dex with keen scaling. But bows don't get any of that. Bows can only be standard affinity, so they can't change their scaling at all. And I feel this was a design oversight, as being able to give keen affinity to bows to change their scaling to dex feels like you should be able to do that. Or adding natural fire, frost, or bleed to a bow would be awesome, because elemental arrows do pretty much nothing right now. They're pretty much useless. Even enemies that are weak to fire take maybe 10 more damage from fire arrows, because they only add 40 magic, fire, or thunder damage depending on your arrow. And when you have 250 physical damage and 40 fire, that extra fire damage really isn't going to do much. If we could have a fire affinity bow that removes most of the physical damage and gives it fire, so 100 fizz, 150 fire, and then you're using fire arrows to get 190 fire damage, then yeah, most of our damage is gonna be fire, and we can use that instead of the physical defenses of an enemy. That would make sense. Even arrows like Bleed or Frost take 15 to apply their statuses on a boss, which is pretty annoying. Bleed arrows still end up being the best arrows for anything that can bleed, because it's effectively free damage when they proc, and no other arrow, elemental weakness or not, can compete with the bleed procs. So pretty much all the arrows in the game are bad compared to bleed. And I wish I could carry more arrows too, because you can only carry 700 arrows right now, and that's not enough. Bosses take 100 to 150 arrows, which is kinda dumb. And there's no bell bearing to buy the bird feathers to make fletched arrows, so you have to manually grind birds forever to make arrows. It's super annoying. I hate arrows in Elden Ring, and I hate how bows were handled. Okay, I had mentioned Ashes of War earlier, and bows, they have some pretty awful ashes. Outside of the default skills, the only thing they really have is like Enchanted Arrow, which hits enemies who are kind of strafing your shots, which admittedly is pretty good. It just costs a lot of FP, but you can't put it on great bows, so it's like, okay, well, great. Rain of Arrows, which is just way too expensive, is really bad. Like really, really bad. If you're outside the skills effective range, arrows just drop on you and don't go anywhere. And of course you have no idea how far is too far. But like, why can't we put Ashes of War like stomps, breath attacks, roars, and slide, and buffs that don't require weapons specifically in your hand to use? I'd love to have Warfrost stomp on a bow and then get like Frostbite naturally, so I can pair it with Frost Arrows and have like an ice bow set up, and then I could stomp when enemies get close. Sounds like fun, right? Oh well. So the next complaint I have is that enemies, well, most non-monstrous enemies, end up just sidestepping arrows infinitely as they approach you, making arrows extremely hard to land, especially because manual aim is awful. And I'm sure some casters can feel what I'm feeling, as the AI is pretty much the same for all projectiles. It just makes bows only good for like one-tap kills from afar with great bows, and if you can't kill them in one hit, well, you're going to be swapping to melee anyway. Now, arrows also get caught on all sorts of invisible terrain or go right through enemies at times, which wouldn't be too terrible if it didn't take 4 seconds to load a great arrow, and then only be able to carry 30 great arrows or 20 great bolts isn't really helping that either. It just gets really annoying really fast. And then finally, there's no synergy with items at all. Yes, there are 2 talismans for range, like the 10% damage, which I mean I guess is fine. 10% of like hitting for 300 is like 30 more damage, which really isn't a lot. But I guess it's something, it's just boring. And the extended range for bows is again fine for sniping, but it's not really useful in a lot of areas or most bosses, so you don't really need that at all. But those are pretty much the only things that work for ranged. Like the bleed and poison talismans only activate when you apply their status in melee, so you don't really get to play poison bow builds with those. And jump attacks, which are great for bows in Elden Ring, because it's a lot faster than drawing arrows normally, they don't get the benefits from like Claw Talisman or the jump attack cloak, so I don't like that. It feels weird. Like, why doesn't anything work for bows? You end up having to run like Stat Talisman as your best choice, which feels terrible because the scaling is terrible, so you're getting like 5 more damage for your weapons. It's like, woo, big deal. So wrapping this all back around, the main reason why I dislike bow builds is because consumables exist, and they're better than bow builds in pretty much every aspect besides their range. Kukris and Phantom Knives are much stronger than bows, and throwing them is faster, and you can follow up with them faster, and they pull faster, and they weigh nothing, and they're cheaper than arrows. You don't have to farm for them at all. You can do poison, bleeds, rot, and stuff with throwables, and they all scale way better than bows do, which is a little sad. I plan to swap my build over to a throwable build just because it seems way more effective than bows. Even though that's a pretty low bar to set, I mean, it is still a meme build, it's gonna feel better. But yeah, that's basically my thoughts on bows at this point. I would love a mod to allow bows to equip more ashes and get new affinities so we can change their scalings and properties. And I'll finish my playthrough up with my bow build, but ultimately, I would not recommend anyone to play bow builds. You're effectively just playing a bad bleed build. But yeah, that's it for me. Thank you all for watching, and good luck out there.